The first time I picked up a pair of knitting needles, I would have been 9 or 10. And yes, it was my grandmother who taught me how to cast on, knit, and purl. But when I went home from that summer vacation, I was not able to maintain the process of making knots with sticks and string. Well, I could make knots, but they didn't look like they were supposed to, and knitting was more frustrating than enjoyable. Although every time I went back to my grandparents' house or they came to visit us, I would sit down beside my grandma while she made slippers for one of the many people who received them. Or perhaps she was knitting cotton dishcloths, and I would get swept away in the mesmerizing rhythm of her needles. I would soon be asking for help once again to learn how to knit. Nothing ever really stuck though, until I was 17. I started dating a man who I would later marry, and we spent a lot of time with his family in the early days of our relationship. His mother, Linda, is a knitter, and although she refused to teach me how to knit, she did give me a book and took me to the store to pick out yarn and needles for my first project. She helped me cast on for the first time, but the rest of my talent came from that old knitting book. It would have been published in the 1960s. The pictures were black ink drawings, and it had a price stamp of 75 cents on it. Knitting was still really frustrating for me, although Linda told me that my tension was excellent, and I could tell the difference now between a knit and a purl stitch. I really struggled with drop stitches, twisted stitches, extra stitches, and unintentional decreases. I'm not certain where my determination came from. Maybe it was in the joy that I had every time I wore my grandmother's slippers. Or perhaps it came from the beautiful sweaters and vests and shawls that Linda wore. But I refused to let go of the needles this time around. I was definitely going to become a knitter. The first real project that I decided to knit, after mastering the obligatory dishcloth and toque, was a cardigan. The pattern was for a very basic sweater with the fronts overlapping one another and a drawstring to tie them closed around your waist. I went to the craft store and I bought discount yarn in a medium gray color. I borrowed the right size of needles from Linda and I cast on. After 9 irksome months attempting to read this pattern, read the material that I was creating, and finally try to sew all 4 pieces together, I ended up with a sweater. Well, more accurately, I ended up with a house coat. A house coat large enough to fit my partner. I was so frustrated. But it's been 15 years since that first house coat sweater thing, and I'm still knitting. I have made socks that I have to encourage to get around my heel. I've made sweaters where the sleeves are way too long. And I've even shrunk one of my wool sweaters. It was my first experience in cabled knitting. There have been a lot of frustrating moments along the way, but the passion that I have for knitting is able to outweigh all of that frustration that it causes me regularly. The short story that I shared from earlier by Robin Romes goes on to tell about her pathway of knitting and how creating knitted items in order to counter the sadness in her life, time and time again. From the terminal illness that lasted 10 years before taking her mother's life, to a baby set sweater that was created soulless during a time when her publishing house downsized her, She writes about how knitting can be a creation in the face of sadness. Another artist, Julia Cameron, who is well known for the book that she wrote called The Artist's Way, argues that creativity is the universe's gift to us. And then our using the creativity is our gift back to the universe. Julia Cameron created the book The Artist's Way in the early 1990s, after teaching the material for a decade in New York City, and then sending materials around the world by post. This material moves through 12 chapters, each to be accomplished over the course of a week, to help people recover from their inner critic, to recover their sense of power and possibility, and to recover a sense of faith in themselves. In one of the introductory chapters, Cameron states about the 12 steps that the process will follow a similar path as a roller coaster. Stages of giddiness will be followed closely by anger, grief, and hope. She says this choppy growth phase is followed by a strong urge to abandon the process and return to life as we know it. People are often tempted to abandon the work at this point. And so is the pathway of creation. Something that frustrates you, but can create a counterbalance in the face of sadness and grief. And often something that tempts people to give up on their aspirations. And it is times like this that the power of creativity, the power of creation, becomes too much to manage. How do creators overcome that sense of abandon, the peaks and valleys of the roller coaster that has many times been called the birthing process of creation? How is it that we move from frustration to creation, like I did? How do we allow our passion to take hold of our fear and our grief and our rage to manage something creative, like Robin Rome's talked about? One suggestion, Julia Cameron has said, is to play with our creativity rather than to work on it. This concept is not really new to Western or North American world. Everything that we do is work, whether it is our job that earns us our income, cleaning up the house that we live in, or sitting down at our computer to answer emails and proofread the minutes from our last committee meeting. It seems only natural that after our work is over and we've completed our housework and our church work, then maybe we can spend some time working on our creativity. Cameron argues that this way of looking at our creativity is not helpful, and I would agree with her. In order to encourage her students to play rather than work with their creativity, she requires an artist's date once a week, where the readers spend 3 to 4 hours each week taking themselves out on an artistic date. This could be to go to the craft store or an art gallery, take a lesson in pottery throwing, or spend a morning exploring the internet for new inspiration. If we can learn how to find the joy of creation, the joy of creating something from almost nothing, then maybe we can harness some of that power that makes creation such a mystery. Cameron also states that moving through the chapters in her book is a spiritual exercise, one that is done to create alignment with the creative energy of the universe, connecting her readers to maybe the mystery. Karen Herring, Unitarian Universalist literary minister, says the same thing in her book, Writing to Wake the Soul, Opening the Sacred Conversations Within, saying that the human gift of language is born of the desire to connect And religion too, in the root of the word and in its best practice, is about what binds us together, one person and one moment to the next. Herring's book, although not an invitation to recovery, is a chance to discover our creativity through writing about theological themes, touching on this same idea of creation and grief. Herring argues our grief, displacement, and disillusionment are real, if often unnameable. And the joy, love, and wild appreciation that sometimes arise in the midst of deep grief can be just as unspeakable. And that our need to create stories out of such chaos is a basic human impulse. I felt such a need to understand why I was able to find creative joy amongst all of the frustration in my knitting. And so when in 2012, the young adult group that I was part of decided to lead a soulful sundown or a circle worship service, reflecting on our spiritual practices, I knew that I was going to write about knitting. We wanted to share with the congregation how spiritual practices had helped us to overcome difficulties in our lives and allow us to embrace the challenges of being a young adult. About my spiritual practice, I wrote, "Knitting has the ability to distract my hands while focusing my mind. I am able to go inward and meditate on an idea or concentrate on a speech. And although I can knit without paying attention, and it allows me to watch television or sit still in the car as a passenger, I also listen better when I have knitting in my hands. But one of the most satisfying times is when I turn my attention inward. The fact that I can take my knitting needles everywhere helps me to find ease and balance in an unknown world. Knit through everything, through the mess of emotions or a struggle with logic. Knitting helps me face my challenges in life. But I have also learned very strong messages from my knitting. Methodically winding a knotted mess into a fresh ball of yarn shows me that I can work through anything. Twisting cables, creating elegant lace, stranding together multiple colors, or turning the heel flap of a sock all give me a sense of completion and wholeness. This inward attention is where I find and nurture my spirituality. I can mend and make, reshape, and redefine. The things that I find important, the things that I don't understand, the things that I struggle with all get worked out in my brain while my yarn is worked out in my hands. While working on this sermon, I had a knitting project in my lap. Whenever my fingers weren't moving across the keyboards, they were moving across the knitting needles. I currently have 2 projects on the go. One that sits here in the living room. It's a shawl in blues, purples, and grays that I'm making for a very dear friend. And the other one is by my computer, and it is the beginnings of a cardigan in a beautiful aqua blue color. Being able to have that yarn running through my hands allows me to get in touch with a different side of my creativity, allowing the opportunity for a different kind of creation. The power behind this is still a mystery to me. Whether your creation is knitting socks, creating a story, making music, or cooking a feast, perhaps it's writing a lecture, know that the university needs your creations. There are many paths to creativity and many different ways to create. What will your path teach you? What will you do with that call of creation? Thank you.